to start with the next lecture. Can I request everyone at the back to please take your seats? Can everyone at the back please take their seats? Everyone at the back who's got their tea and coffee, can you please bring it to your tables? The topic for our next lecture is Dignity and Development as Trajectory, Bihar as a Model for Nepal. This lecture will be chaired by Syed Gulrez Hoda, Member Bihar State Planning Board, and delivered by Blair, Senior Research Scholar, Yale University, New Haven. We'll have about 30 minutes for the lecture, and then we can take question and answers. Can I request the chairperson to please take over the proceedings?
Thank you. Welcome all to this posty session on dignity and development, Bihar as a model for Nepal. When I look at this, the theme of the conference, I'm tempted to add Nepal before Bihar and Jharkhand and talk of Nepal, Bihar and Jharkhand. Shared history and shared vision, though maybe shared political history could be a little contentious. We've just come from a technical session on Nepal and the connections, and at the mention of the Treaty of Sugauli, people were already reaching for the sabers on both sides. So we'll stay away from the politics of it, but surely as it comes to shared maybe spirituality and culture and economy would be less contentious. And certainly when it comes to geography, it's a no-brainer. I mean, we can't wish away the fact that Bihar and Nepal are neighbors. So in this session, we have Professor Blair. He will walk us through on another area which we can share amongst ourselves. A brief introduction for Professor Blair. He's a noted scholar on South Asia. He's with the Yale University. Prior to Yale University, he's worked and lectured in a number of prestigious universities in the United States. He has an old connection with Bihar. His dissertation was on the politics of Bihar. He's worked mainly in the area of democracy and governance. He has been an advisor or consultant to a number of multilateral and bilateral institutions, including the World Bank, the UNDP, USAID, the Swedish Fund. And a last mention on his bio, which is not mentioned here, which I picked up on his talk when he was chairing Atul Vashni's talk, is that he was a committed soldier in the US Army, where he told us that he had taken oath to the Constitution and told us all that when ill winds buffet democratic societies, the defender of faith is the Constitution and nobody else. So with those words, Professor Blair.
Okay, we're on. Oh, I should say about my military experience, like so many of my age, during the Vietnam conflict, I was in the Army for a couple of years, but it was a brief but educational experience. And fortunately, it was not necessary to rely on the Constitution to disobey any orders coming from higher levels of command during my time. The program has been switched around quite a bit, and my presentation has been switched along with it. So if you were hoping to hear someone else at this time, apologies. I hope you'll find something interesting. And if you came to listen to me, well, thank you for being so patient as my time has been switched around several times. Let me begin by saying this is it's an experiment. Doing this because it seemed like a really fascinating idea to compare Bihar and Nepal. I'm still. Can you hear me in the back now? Everything okay in the back there? Yeah, okay, good. I'm still putting together these ideas, and I'm eager for more. If you have any suggestions and don't have a chance to offer them here at the moment, or talk to me later on during our conference, please send me an email. That's my email address up there, harry.blair@yale.edu. I'd be very pleased to hear from you. Hey, in the last session yesterday, we indulged ourselves in a little counterfactual imaginary history, wondering, well, what would have happened if the British had lost in 1857? What would things be like? Well, Rajiv Gandhi indulged in a little imaginary history. In 1985, he visited the United States, made a speech to the Congress, and among other things, he observed that, and this is especially interesting to me, being involved with Yale University, he said, "The ties that bind our two peoples are many. You have gained your independence just as we were losing ours. And many of the people that were involved were the same. We wish that Yale had founded a university for us instead of being governor of Madras in the late 17th century, and that Lord Cornwallis had surrendered in Delhi rather than to General Washington at Yorktown in 1783. Well, it is kind of interesting to imagine. Suppose Yale, actually the reason he was able to give the money to Yale was that he left Madras under a bit of a cloud, I gather. He had a little confusion between which money was supposed to go into the company's account and which was supposed to go into his own. But he made off with enough to give some to Yale and start our operation. But suppose instead of that, he'd been a good guy over here and started the university, and Yale University in Chennai was a great institution these days. And suppose Lord Cornwallis had won at Yorktown. America would probably be a small British colony on the east coast of North America, with the rest of the continent being managed by the French, the Spanish, and the Russians. Well, let's go back to reality. And Yale is in Connecticut, and we're here in Patna. Okay, this is an outline of my presentation. The way I got into this was I started in Bihar in the late 1960s doing the field work for my dissertation. I came back several times to Bihar in the later 60s and in the 70s. The last time I was here was actually 1986, so it's 30 years since I've been in Patna. But it's fun to come back, and especially on an occasion like this with this great conference that's been put on. Well, most recent, I kind of wandered off from Bihar, got into Maharashtra, worked in Bangladesh quite a bit, Then got into Southeast Asia, as far away as Latin America, a little bit of Eastern Europe as well. Most recently, I've been in Nepal several times, working to evaluate foreign aid programs, doing a little work on the applied side of political science, and was there long enough to get really quite interested in Nepal and what was going on there. And the more times I went back to Nepal, the more it seemed to me that there were some parallels here between Nepal and Bihar. In particular, both these systems have been under long-term elite control for decades, if not centuries. They were two backwaters of development. There was a increasing demand from underclass in both systems to be included in this elite-dominated polity. There has been some success in Bihar and a partial success in Nepal. And Bihar has now become something of a development success story. Well, could this same kind of scenario unfold in Nepal? I thought, well, it's an idea worth exploring, so why not? And this is then going to be my presentation. First, a look at Bihar. This will be no new knowledge to most of you, but I want to kind of get on the same page with everybody so that we can explore Nepal a bit. So, the historian Bihar, well known to you all, the long upward search for dignity, empowerment, a place in the political system, is up, as it were, on the part of the backwards in Nepal that came to fruition under Lalu Prasad Yadav, and then a development enterprise under Nitish Kumar. In Nepal, that dignity search is still a work in progress, and the prospects for development remain to be seen. But the question then is, can this model be switched from the one place to the other? Or can it be replicated, let's put it that way. To look at Bihar, I don't think this PowerPoint is really working right. Shouldn't it fill the whole screen? I guess it is. Okay, sorry. The theme in Bihar has been, in Christophe Jacoulot's expression, the rise of the plebeians. Here's a familiar story to almost all of you. The demographic groups in Bihar, based on the 1931 census, updated to reflect the 2000 partition in Bihar. We have the upper caste, the Brahmins, the Bhumihars, the Rajputs, caste is included there too, about 18% of the population. The other backward castes, the OBCs, can be divided into two groups. First, the traditional peasant proprietor castes, the Yaras, Kurmis, and Koiris. The Buniyas are usually thrown in there as well. Mistakenly, I think. They should be in with the upper caste, but that's the way the 1931 census put it. We got about a quarter of the population, or a little less. The lower OBCs are much smaller groups. The Tailis are the largest, about 3%, and Hanuks 2.5%. And then the, what was it, the Munguri Lal Commission found 128 other backward castes, I think. And then the BP Mundal Commission found something like 256 backward castes in Bihar. So some of them must have been mighty small indeed. Then we have the Dalits, about 18%, Muslims 17%, and a few others making up the total. The politics in Bihar from the 60s to the 90s what we find is after a couple of decades of uninterrupted Congress rule after independence in 1947, other political parties began to get into the act. There began to be some competition for votes. These upper caste leaders that were in charge of the Congress found themselves needing to reach out for votes. They recruited candidates from the other backward castes to pull in votes from these groups. Gradually more and more OBCs won seats in the state legislature, and then finally they took power in the legislature. There was a false dawn, you could say, with Karpuri Thakur in the late 1970s, and then the true breakthrough came in 1990 with Lalu Prasad Yadav. And this graph is showing the representation in the Vidhan Sabha and the blue line is the upper caste, the orange line is the upper OBCs, and the green line, the lower OBCs. You can see the trend going upward there from the first election in 1952 up to when Lalu takes power in 1990 and then secures it in 1995 with the upper backwards forming something like 40% of the MLAs. At the same time, the forward castes are going down. Okay, Lalu in power, I think there's no question that the psychic income for the OBCs went up. A sense of dignity, self-respect, empowerment is very much there after Lalu's time in office. In addition, protection for the Muslims, especially in the Ayodhya affair in 1992. At the same time, there was a distinct administrative decline in Lalu's time, as it seems to be the case that he was so anxious to unseat the forward caste, to displace them, that when posts in the government service went unfilled, if he couldn't find an OBC to fill the post, it simply didn't get filled. So the more and more seats became vacant. Perhaps more importantly, in the budgetary allocations, a large portion was unspent altogether, and over the course of his administration, that proportion increased. More and more money didn't get spent, which meant not much went to development. Benefits, mostly to the backward caste, and reputedly mostly to the Yadavs, in fact. Corruption up, the fodder scam that in the later 1990s that put Lalu in jail for a while. As one study put it by Matthew and McMoore, it was almost as though, in fact, it wasn't almost as though, as they put it, it was in fact state incapacity by design. It was more important to unseat the forwards than to manage the state, in other words. As a result, per capita income sagged behind the all-India average during his term. I think I have a graph here on that. Ooh, what happened to it? Oh, no, that'll come later, sorry. So, this development did not go all that well, but there's no question that Lalu had changed the game in terms of identity politics. Now, in 2010, or 2005, excuse me, along comes another game changer, Nitish Kumar, who formed an alliance with the BJP for the election in 2000. It didn't work that time, but next time around in 2005, they had put together a campaign effort that was quite successful indeed. Now here's some figures on the elections. 2000, this RJD, Lalu's party, is in the middle there, and the BJP and JD alliance on the right. In the 2000 election, we see Lalu capturing the Yadav vote and the Muslim vote. That was enough to give him, 28% of the votes overall. The BJP, and it was called the Samata Party then under Nitish, they got a large portion of the upper caste votes, but less than half, as it turned out, 42%. They got about 40% of the Kurmi-Khoiri votes, not as well as they did later. Put all that together and they got about 21%, lost the election by 7 points. 5 years later, they had their act together. If we look at over there on the right at the alliance, it goes up to about 2/3 of the upper caste votes. We get 61%, 3/5 of the Kurmi-Khoiri votes, almost half of the lower OBC vote, and it's a 12-point victory for Nitish. And that same formula works pretty well in 2010 as well. All did not go swimmingly with this alliance, however. The rivalry between Nitish and Narendra Modi, then the governor of Gujarat, grew over this time after the 2010 election. Nitish split with Modi in 2013, and the result in the next election was something of a disaster for Nitish and his government. Looking here, on the right-hand side, we've got the Lok Sabha vote in 2014. The BJP alliance did smashingly well, not only with the upper caste, but look at the other OBC line there. 53% they won. The Dusads among the Dalits under Ramvilas Paswan had defected to the BJP, 68% there, and the RJD, Lalu's party, and Nitish's party, the JDU, left out in the wilderness. I think the grand total was maybe BJP won all but 6 or 8 seats in Bihar. It was really quite a disaster for Nitish as well as Lalu. Well, they learned something from this, that if they put their votes together, they would have won, so they formed an alliance for the next election. They kissed and made up, as it were. These rivals were reconciled. In 2015, go back to this slide here. Okay, now we've got the Vidhan Sabha vote for 2015, the Grand Alliance. The green oval there shows how it came together. Yadavs on board, the Kurmis on board, the Khoiris. There was an independent party started by a Khoiri that pulled away many of those votes. But they did fairly well with the OBCs and won most of the Muslim votes and returned to power. The BJP, that's worth remarking, now got 84% of the upper caste votes. So there seems there's an increasing division here between upper castes and the rest in terms of voting in Bihar, drifting apart even further than they had been before. Other OBCs, more of them voted for the NDA than for the Grand Alliance, also interesting to note. And we also have the Dusads here, but nonetheless, Nitish is back in power. Here's the MLA victors for the Nitish era. We see in 2005 and 10, upper castes and upper OBCs about the same. And when the alliance held together, when it comes apart, and for 2015, the OBCs now have about 40%. The upper castes have gone down to 20%. Okay, that's the political story, which I think we can conclude has been not just a revolution, but a transformation of political power in Bihar, with the OBCs pretty much now replacing the upper caste. Okay, development, how did that come along? After Nitish had been in power 5 years, we started getting these rave reviews of developmental success in Bihar. Here's one from The Economist in January 2010. The headline to the article reads, "On the move, Bihar's remarkable recovery. In the New York Times, a couple months later, there was a front page story above the fold even with a picture that took up most of the front page, and the headline was "Turnaround of India State Could Serve as a Model." Hey, looking into this a little more, this is a graph showing the division of the state budget between development funds and non-development funds. Are often called establishment funds, recurrent expenditure, the payroll, or ordinary operating expenses of the budget. We can see that under Lalu, the two were about the same at what, about 10,000 crores a year. When Nitish takes over, the non-development recurrent budget goes up a little bit, but the development budget really takes off in Bihar, up from about 10,000 crores a year to more than 60,000. By 2015, there were some definite evidence of this. Primary school enrollment gone up from about 13 million to 23 million. Infant mortality down from 61 per thousand to 42. Death rate from 8.1 to 6.6. This set of graphs is really my favorite here. This shows the per capita net domestic product for Bihar and for India as a whole, starting in 1987. We see when Lalu came into office, Bihar was about 53% of the all India level. By the time Lalu left office, the Bihar's net domestic product had gone up a little bit, but after the All India reforms in the early 1990s, the All India level had gone up a lot, and Bihar is now only about 33% of the All India level. We have extended the graph here to when Nitish took office, and we see Bihar going up. That's the blue line at the bottom there, beginning to get into some serious development. But if you look a little further, you see the All India graph is going up even more. Looks like the gap is widening here between Bihar and India. But if we look at it with a log scale, a logarithmic scale, here what we're showing is the rate of increase rather than the number of the numerical increase. And if you look very carefully, you can see that the blue line is the level of it, the slant of it, is going up a little faster than the orange line. And I extended it here. If both these proceed at the same rate, and by 2032, they'll converge. Bihar's per capita net domestic product is going to equal that of the all India level. Now, there's no reason to think that it's absolutely going to turn out that way, but it's nice to think that Bihar is on the way to catching up. Okay, some lessons from Bihar. What is it telling us? After the partition in 1947, Bihar operated on what might be called a neo-patrimonial Congress model with upper caste dominance, mainly through landholding. Part of the legacy of our friend Lord Cornwallis and the permanent land settlement. Elections were run largely through vote banks with upper castes running vote banks and directing the votes of those below them. Little incentive for development if things were going well for the upper caste, and why get too excited about stuff like development. OBC ascendancy is in progress here, and it didn't start in the 1960s. It started, as we heard this afternoon, in the 1920s, and finally emerged successfully in the 1990s. I think that if we look for what the key driver of all this was, I think it was democratic politics, the need to reach out for votes to recruit people from the non-upper caste elements of the population. And along with this OBC empowerment also comes the demand for development, and together this is what produced the election win in 2015. So there's a kind of mantra here, which we could say dignity before development, first Lalu and then Natish. And we learn that under Natish, that with focused and developed and dedicated leadership in a state like Bihar, a poor state can really make progress. Okay, let's turn to Nepal here. Is this coming? Oh, it looks good there. Nepal, as you know, is north of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. The western half of Nepal sits on top of Uttar Pradesh on the map. The eastern half is north of Bihar on the map. If you look carefully where the line is, you can see the indentation in Nepal. That's the old Champaran district there. Now, Nepal has 4 regions we can talk of, each one of them running east to west. A little geography lesson here. The gray-looking area along the border with India, usually called the Tarai. The tannish looking area above that, the inner Tarai is called. The Tarai is an extension of the Gangetic Plain, roughly same climate, same ecology, same monsoon season and so on. The inner Tarai is slight hills there, but basically pretty much like the Tarai. Then the gray part, or the light brown part, is the hills called the Pahad in Nepali, same word as in Hindi. And then the yellow and brown, these are the very sparsely populated mountain areas. So we got 4 regions here, the Tarai, the inner Tarai, which collectively are often called the Madhesh, the hills, the Pahad, and the mountains. The Pahad is the location of the long dominant caste groups that I'll be talking about shortly, Brahmins and Kshatriyas. There are other hill Hindus there, but fewer than we would expect. And let me get into then a description of the demographic makeup of Nepal. Now, unlike India, which last collected caste data in 1931, and we hear and have good reason to believe that a lot of caste data were collected in 2011, but so far as I know, they haven't been released. If anybody has any information on this, I'd love to hear it about the 2011 census in India. I think some data have been released on scheduled castes and tribes, but not otherwise. Anyway, let's go back to Nepal. Okay, hill elites in Nepal. These are the hill Brahmins, and the Kshatriyas there are called Chetris, and together they form about almost 30% of the population. You can compare that on the right here, upper caste in Bihar, are there 18%, so about 10% more on the upper caste. Other hill Hindus, this is a real surprise to me. There's a Dalit population, we can see about 8%, but the large Shudra communities are largely missing in the hill areas there. There's only a couple of caste Hindu communities. And the Tarai, that looks more like Bihar with a large number of castes. The Yadavs have 4%, that's the largest caste there. There's 35 others, more or less the same as you find in Bihar, and a Dalit population. They make up about 20%. Now the Adivasis of Nepal, who are now called Janajatis there, they number something like 50 groups, with some fairly large, the Hill Muggers, 7%, Tamangs, about 6%, others collectively about 10%. There's one large group of Janajatis down on the plain in the Tarai called the Tarus. There are also not quite a number of Tarus in the Champaran area, so some of you may be familiar with them. Okay, collectively, if everybody that we might count as Madhesi is about 20% or 28% if we include Tarus there, about 22% if not. Muslims number about 4% in Nepal, and then others make up the rest of the population. Okay, there are clusters of these people, these different groups. Nepal has got 75 districts, you can see on the lower left there. In 24 of those districts, these hill elites, that is the Kshatris and the Brahmins, make up more than 30% of the population. I don't think there's anywhere, any district in Bihar where one caste group makes up 30% of the population. Maybe over there in the far eastern part of Purnia, Muslims might, but otherwise not. The Janajati groups, you can see there the Tarus over on the left, Muggars have in 5 districts, Gurungs, Tamangs, Rais, and Nimbus. They make up, I can't read it on this, plotted out there. Anyway, about 26, 28 districts, something like that. So the definite clusters of populations. Okay, there are some cross-cutting cleavages in Nepal that make politics a little more difficult than they might otherwise be. The Taru community, down here on, you can see on the lower left, the brown colored areas. They're Janajatis, but they're also Madhesis. So should they...
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, okay, thank you. They can make common cause with the other Janajatis and try and advance their interests that way, or they can do so with the Madhesis and do it that way, or get mixed up in trying to figure out what they're going to do. Dalits, much the same here. Go back here, there's the Hill Dalits and the Tarai Dalits in red here on the chart. The Hill Dalits can decide, no, we're going to throw in our lot with the other Hill Hindus and try and get ahead that way, or we can make unity with the other Hindus in the Tarai, or we can work as Dalits, combining our numbers. We'd have what, 12-13% of the population, which should be enough to make some headway. Languages in Nepal, there's 3 major languages. Nepali, the official language, but there's large numbers of Maithili speakers, also Bhojpuri speakers down there in Madhes. And there's something like 100 minor tongues, mostly spoken by the Janajatis, and mostly not intelligible to each other, quite separate languages. Much of Nepali history has been trying to promote a national culture in Nepal in which everybody would speak the Nepali language, everybody would be a Hindu. Buddhism is discouraged in this picture, presented as a national picture, but people who are not Brahmins or Kshatris tend to see this as not a national picture at all. It's a Brahmin Kshatri culture that is trying to be imposed on us. A very brief political history of Nepal is in order here. Since the country was unified in the mid-1700s, ever since then, down to 1990, it's been dominated by this authoritarian Brahmin-Kshatri combination, somewhat like the upper caste domination of Bihar. In 1990, a popular uprising led to an end of that system and introduction of a multi-party democracy, which has been in power for the last, 25 years. But in this democratic system, the Brahmins and the Kshatris still dominated under their 2 major parties. But as that was going on, the Madhesis, the Janajatis, and the Dalits all began to become more conscious of their their situation and more concerned about advancing their situation, mobilizing themselves. This was all interrupted for about 10 years, from 1996 to 2006, by a Maoist insurgency that really tore up the country. Thousands of people were killed in this conflict. The Janajatis and the Dalits were the main supporters, affected by the message of the Maoists that you deserve a place in this system, not just the upper caste. And by 2006, it was obvious to both sides that neither was going to win, that the only solution to this was some kind of peace agreement. One was made called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, a kind of elite pacting of the sort that occurred in El Salvador and some of the Latin American countries. The leaders of the conflicting groups came together, made this peace agreement, and agreed that they would have an election, would have a new constitution, and they would abolish the monarchy. They would commit themselves to a federalist system which would give a voice to these marginal groups. An interim constitution set up in 2007, set up a parliament that had two kinds of seats, first past the post seats, which is the familiar Westminster system that you all know, where the territory is divided into single-member seats. Whoever gets the most votes in each seat wins that seat. Proportional representation, less familiar. About 2/3 of the seats were proportional representation seats, so each voter then gets two ballots, one for the first past the post MP and the other for the proportional representation, which is one big constituency. So if Party A gets 26% of the proportional representation, PR vote, then it gets 26% of those seats. It's a closed list, so you don't know who you're voting for. You only vote for the party. In the 2008 election, held shortly after the Constitution was promulgated, the Maoists won the most seats, took over not enough to establish a majority. They needed a coalition with a few minor parties. But surprisingly, instead of the Maoists radicalizing the political system moderated the Maoists, who soon became mainstream players in the system. This Constituent Assembly met for 4 years to plan out the federal system, didn't manage to do so, ran out of time, new election held in 2013. This is an example of one of the schemes for federalism that was developed. The 14 states was written for states, and you can see by the names that it was thought that the different states would be dominated by different groups.
Please flag We'll be moving into Q&A time.
Oh, okay, I'll wind up here. So the federal system was created in the election. You can see what happened here. The first past the post seats, the PR seats, and the total seats for the Brahmins and Kshatris wound up about this surplus of seats over their share of the population. Janajatis and Madhesis about the same. Dalits and others got excluded. So winding up here, let's go to this. The new Constitution in 2015, and this is the critical point here in red, both of them specify that the parties will ensure a proportional representation of seats, with the PR seats being used to make up any inequalities that come from the first past the post seats, in accordance with the law there in red. This was partially effective, but in the next version, 2015, look at the underlined phrase there, it would all be the same except on the basis of population. So if implemented, this would guarantee that the population would be represented as such in the legislature. Okay, on the economic side, very quickly, We got Bihar at the end of Lalu's administration and in 2015, and then Nepal here also in 2015. You can see in the primary sector, Nepal is still behind where Bihar was in Lalu's time. The idea being that part of the development is a reduction in the primary sector's contribution to gross domestic product and increase in the others. And we find that a similar pattern of being behind here as well. Economic development, the blue line is Bihar. It's now settled out at about 8 to 9% per capita increase in GDP. And Nepal is settled out too, but that's at 3 to 4%, rather less. Okay, what do we know here? The key question is in Nepal, the Janajatis, the Dalits, the Madhesis have, as a Marxist would put it, they have become groups in themselves. They are conscientized, they are self-aware, they are looking for advancement. But can they become groups for themselves, active in their own interest? In Bihar, the plebeians replaced elites in managing the state. In Nepal, they're going to have to learn to join the elites in doing so. Is this possible? The answer, the answer I can figure out is cross-party caucuses, where people who are Madhesis from different parties work together across party lines. And there's good evidence from Latin America and Africa that women's caucuses have been quite effective in this regard. Another example would be Hispanic caucuses in the U.S. Congress. There are Republican Hispanic representatives who can work with the Democrats. Okay, I'll leave you with this thought. Bihar is not a perfect model, but it does provide some guidelines, I think. This idea of first dignity and then possibilities of serious development. Two things to remember. In 2005, everybody who knew anything about Bihar knew that it was a hopeless case. It would never go anywhere and not develop much at all. And then look what's happened. It has turned around. The second thing to keep in mind is that if you go back to, say, 1950, India and South Korea had about the same per capita income. They were two development backwaters that most economists basically wrote off as candidates for development. India has progressed a lot since then, but South Korea has really taken off and currently is among the more advanced countries of the world. So the same thing can happen in Bihar and hopefully in Nepal. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Blair. We have 5 minutes for questions. I see a lot of hands. Maybe we start from the extreme right. You gentlemen in the black shirt or black jumper, I can't make out from it. And then we'll work our way to the left of the hall.
Sir, Muslims have a population of 16.9% of Bihar population, but they won 23 seats out of 243. 9.5% only, which is too low comparing to other single community which has same percent of population in Bihar. What is the main reason behind it, and how can more Muslim candidates win the seat and can work for the development of their community?
What's your one-line question? How many? Who can win? Can you repeat very briefly? One line. What's your question? Who can win seats? What was your question?
The Muslims have a population.
Muslims in Nepal you're talking about?
Bihar.
Okay. You're asking if how Muslims can win more seats in Bihar?
Yes, sir.
Okay, this session is on Nepal. So if he has the time, he will answer that question. Can we move on? Yeah, we'll take 3 questions.
Thank you very much for bringing dignity into development, which is mostly understood as roti kapra or makan. And thank you for those detailed data on Bihar. I'll build on both in my presentation, which will follow immediately. My question to you is, Nepal is a sovereign state and Bihar is a federal unit of India. Are the two comparable units of analysis?
Thank you. Maybe he had gentleman in the black blazer as the mic. Maybe you can go with it.
Sure. Yes, mine was just a general point about the use of the terminology backward castes. You referred to a period when dignity was brought into the belief of the state, and every time I hear the term backward castes, I wonder how is that defined? Who is backward? What does backward mean in terms of castes? My surname is Leather, so I suppose in a way I'm a Chaman, and therefore I would be classified as a backward caste, so I'm quite curious to know where I stand in society. Thank you.
We'll take one more question. Dilip, here in front.
Why the Madhesis in Nepal are being suppressed?
We'll take one more because we don't have too much time. So Dilip, why don't we do the last question from you? And then maybe our visitor from Nepal, did you want to ask? No, okay, go ahead Dilip.
Okay. Now Professor, you gave some very precise statistics on the voting percentage of various castes in Bihar. I would like to know how reliable the source is, because you did quote a source of some books, but considering that votes are secret, how accurate are these figures of the voting of different castes that you quoted?
He's asking you how accurate are the voting figures in Bihar. I guess he's referring to the surveys which are done by CDS Lokniti and post-election surveys which bring out these numbers. But if we are taking these questions, you might also have a view on how to increase Muslim representation in Bihar, which the first gentleman raised the question. But over to you, Professor Harry.
Muslims in Bihar, how can they win more seats? Muslims in Bihar, how can they win more seats? They are a minority. They win easily seats in old Purnia district where they're in plurality and sometimes in a majority. Their best bet is probably the one that they've taken, making an alliance with Lalu, and now with the Grand Alliance of Lalu and Nitish would be a better formula than probably any other one that they could come up with. Bihar is a state and Nepal is a nation. How can I compare them? Well, let's say through heroic creativity, it is possible.
And thinking of both of them as societies.
Yeah, I think it makes a valid comparison. You'll have to be the judge of that. What is dignity? I guess the definition would have to be something like, you know dignity yourself when you feel it, and you can often tell it in other people. In my own experience, I grew up in Virginia, south of Washington, D.C. At the time, it was a very segregated society there. There were separate schools for blacks. Back of the bus, even in the railroad station, there was a drinking fountain, public drinking fountain, that the pipe taking the water to where you would drink it came up from the floor, and then the fountain divided into two, and one side said white and the other side said colored. It was a very southern fried kind of community there. Within 20 years, I could tell that after desegregation and integration of schools and so on, it was very clear to me that the subordinate position of the blacks in their own minds had very much changed. We have still a long way to go to achieve complete equality in the United States, but there was a visible change, an empowerment, and not a little bit of that, of course, came from getting the vote by the black population. Why is the Madhesi separate? Historically, basically, it's a different climate, a different ecology, and a different population going in there. The voting percentage? Yeah, that's from post-poll surveys taken by groups like CSDS of voters as they exit the polling booths. The same is done in all countries, and these things are estimates. They're usually have 3% margin of error, so they're only approximate. But if a whole bunch of different exit polls give pretty much the same results, then you can be pretty sure that they're fairly accurate.
Thank you, Professor Blair. We will end this session now. We're already into the next session's time. Thank you all for attending this session. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to the last